For this episode, we'd go across enemy lines and go to the Russian side and discuss General, or should I say Prince Bagration. Is that how I say it, Jimmy?
Yep, that's good.
All right. And one of the best generals on the Russian side during the Napoleonic era. There's a great quote Napoleon had, quote, "Russia has no good generals. The only exception is Bagration," end quote. And that just sums up what his opponents thought of him. Like, he performed well, not only against the French, but as well in Sweden and some other friends. Correct, Jimmy?
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely correct, yes.
Yep. So let's get into his story. He was born in July of 1765. Was that in Georgia or the Russian Empire? Where was he born?
He was born in Georgia at the time, and he was actually born into the Georgian royal family. I mean, the Bagration dynasty is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, royal dynasty in, well, Europe, depending on whether you call Georgia part of Europe.
Right. Right. But very, very, very famous, very old, like you were saying, and just born into a prominent family.
Yes, and he lived during a period of great difficulty for Georgia. So, like, as far as we're at the time, Georgia was split into 2 or 3 kingdoms, and although they remained nominally independent until the early 19th century, already in the late 18th century, it was moving into the Russian sphere of influence, having previously been under the protection of Persia. So basically, the Georgians were getting caught up in sort of Russian imperial expansion southwards.
Like, it was just an enlarging sphere of influence by Russia, and Georgia was caught up in that. So it looks like he was well educated. In addition to studying Russian, he also learned how to speak German, Persian, Turkish, and Armenian, and Georgian by his father.
Yes, that's right. Although rather uniquely, I think, among sort of Russian aristocrats, he never learned to speak French. But as you say, he had a very privileged upbringing and education, as expected from a prince. And his father, Ivan, served in the Russian army. So Pyotr, as with a lot of Russian aristocrats, followed in his father's footsteps.
Yeah, it's interesting that, I can see in 1782 he enlists in the Imperial Russian Army as a sergeant, not an officer. But he was the eldest son. He could have just lived a life of luxury and taken it easy, but he chose a different path.
Yes, that's true. Although in the Russian Empire, military service was really, the way to be noticed and the way to make your way up the ranks. So you really wanted to be an influential player in Russia. The military was one of the chief ways to achieve that, and certainly the firstborn sons of a lot of aristocrats would have gone into the army, whereas second and third-born sons may have chosen a career either at the court or in the civil service bureaucracy, something like that.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. He had a younger brother, Roman, who would also join the army of the Cossacks and become a general, as did Bagration. In this,
that's right.
2 brothers in the Imperial Russian Army. That's pretty impressive.
With Pyotr specifically, as you say, he signed up to the Russian army in 1782, and it's rather interesting that he did so in the Astrakhan infantry regiment, which is also very closely associated with the likes of Alexander Suvorov and Mikhail Kutuzov, 2 of the greatest Russian commanders, not only of the era, but of Russian history in general.
No, those are 2 good ones to apprentice under, for sure. Did he see action right away or not quite yet?
Well, I think early on he spent a couple of years, fighting in the Caucasus, in the Russian-Circassian War, which is a sort of long drawn-out conflict which lasted over a century. It wasn't until the 1860s that Circassia, which is kind of like, well, almost kind of near sort of like Chechnya, modern day Chechnya, was pacified by the Russian imperial forces. So it was a lot of like irregular warfare that they were fighting at the time.
Yeah, they probably where he learned a lot of his guerrilla warfare tactics, I would imagine.
Yes, absolutely. That sort of theater would provide him with the experience for that. Later on in his career, and after the Caucasus, he soon found himself serving under Suvorov in the Russo-Turkish War from 1787 to 92. And he distinguished himself at the siege of Ochakov in 1788.
Yeah, I got promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1794. Full colonel in 1798 and general in 1799. So he really moved up the ranks. Even for an aristocrat, he moved up pretty quick.
That's very true. And I think part of that was due to the fact that in 1794, when he was serving in Poland, again under Suvorov, suppressing the Kosciuszko uprising, that was where he really struck up a friendship with Suvorov, and he saw him as an inspiration. His aggressive instincts on the battlefield, made a big impression. And later on, while a general, Bagration would often remind his men of Suvorov's famous maxim, in Russia, "Pulya durak, shtik molodets," or "the bullet is a fool, the bayonet a good lad." So the idea that you can't just stand in a line shooting at people. You have to actually go charging on the point of the bayonet and carry the battlefield that way.
Yeah, he strikes me almost as a chess player, almost similar to a Marshall Lawn or even a Davout. Just he liked everything orderly. He wanted his troops in columns. He wanted his batteries of cannons nicely set up. Seems like this guy was pretty advanced in his way of thinking.
Yes, that's right. And it's interesting that you bring up Marshall Land, because there are actually a lot of similarities between the two. They met their ends, mortally wounded on the battlefield. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler. And they met a few times in battle against each other.
That's true, and we'll certainly go on to that fairly soon. And one of the other attributes is that they often found themselves leading vanguards for their respective commanders, partly as a result of their aggressive instincts. But both of them were very resourceful defensive generals as well.
Right.
And so, in February 1799, which is when Bagration was promoted to major general, and then he accompanied Suvorov on his famous Italian and Swiss campaigns as the vanguard commander of the Allied army. So spearheading Allied attacks, especially at the battles of the Jada and the Battle of Novi.
And those went well. Everything went well.
Those went very well.
Until they met Massena in Switzerland, everything was going fine.
Yes, I mean, although to be fair to Suvorov and Bagration, the Battle of Zurich was, they didn't actually get to Zurich before the Second Russian Army under General Korsakov was defeated by Massena. The reasons for the failure of that campaign, because Suvorov and his Austrian allies were immensely successful at pretty much, wiping out all of the gains of Napoleon's first Italian campaign, and and re-establishing Austrian control over northern Italy.
Mhm.
But as a result of that, while Suvorov was basically talking about potentially marching on Paris,
Right.
the Austrians, they began to realize, well, we've got what we wanted.
Right.
We're not really, we're not terribly thrilled about the prospects of these Russians rampaging all over Europe.
Right. Right. And I believe they sent Archduke Charles up north to capture like the Netherlands, and so even before they got to Switzerland, they were kind of breaking apart their force, correct?
Yes. So, Archduke Charles was supposed to be, helping helping the Russians around Zurich, but he basically was under orders to do his own stuff, and that left the Russians very vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that was some of his best work. Suvorov and Bagration was, extricating themselves from that mess before Massena destroyed them all.
Right, precisely, and but as a result of that campaign, basically, the Russians didn't really get very much at all, and even though for the time being the Austrians maintained control over northern Italy, come 1800, First Consul Bonaparte is going to take that away from them again.
Yeah, indeed, and also in that year, the prince gets married, correct?
That's right, and it's so Bagration's relationship with the imperial court is
it's complicated at best, I would say. Yeah,
right, because he is shown some favor. Actually, it is in 1800 when he becomes confirmed as a prince, or knyaz in Russian, because this is when Russia begins annexing the Georgian kingdoms.
Right.
So, and as part of Russian imperial policy, they would often give treatment to the elites of their new subject nations.
Right.
So, and indeed, sometimes more favorably than native Russian aristocrats.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why Bagration was given the title of knyaz.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, during the same year, Tsar Paul basically forced him into marrying Yekaterina, or Catherine Skavronskaya, who was a niece of Grigory Potemkin, Catherine the Great's favorite. But even though there was like an initial infatuation, the marriage was pretty quickly a failure.
Right.
And Catherine soon basically left Russia, went to Vienna, became the mistress of Clemens von Metternich, who within a few years would achieve much greater renown.
Yeah, she had a bit of a wild life, that one.
Well, Metternich basically nicknamed her the Naked Angel because she'd go around Vienna, dressed in rather risque clothing.
Bagration was an angel himself. I mean, at this time he was a heavy gambler and was, getting into a lot of trouble with his losses. He had to sell some of his real estate to cover that, correct?
That's right. With Bagration, I think with that sort of officer's lifestyle, it was kind of like he wasn't the only one doing that sort of thing. But also, part of the reason why he may have been forced into this marriage was because, again, it's difficult to prove anything, but it seems like he enjoyed a pretty close relationship with Grand Duchess Yekaterina Pavlovna, the daughter of Tsar Paul, and basically, the imperial family, even though Bagration was technically royalty.
Right. That's tricky when you're dating your boss's daughter. Yeah.
Indeed.
Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere, and even earn money. All in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since I discovered Spotify for Podcasters, I've really enjoyed the ease of use and the distribution ability of this platform.
And it looks like from there, 1805 is really when he meets the French and Napoleon. Well, he met the French obviously in Switzerland, but this is the first time he's battling against Napoleon.
That's right. And 1805 in general is not a good year for the Russian army. But Bagration was one of the few Russian generals who emerged from the campaign with an enhanced reputation. And in particular, at the Battle of Schoengraben, he was basically, he was part of Kutuzov's army, which was retreating in order to get to Olmutz, to basically regroup after the calamity of Ulm, with General Mack having lost his army.
Right.
And Kutuzov was marching to join Mack, but having learned of the news of Mack's capitulation, he realized that the further he went, the closer he would get to Napoleon, and he was absolutely in no condition to face the Grande Armée at this point. Right. So he had to retreat in order to join up with some Russian reinforcements.
It was clever. Like at this time he only has 7,000 troops, and he's being basically surrounded by 20,000 Frenchmen, and he decides to stall them with talks for an armistice. Correct?
That's right. So at Schoengraben, he's detached with regard, and basically, Kutuzov says, I don't care if all of you die. We need to you need to win us time to get the rest of the army to safety. And as you say, initially Bagration tries to open negotiations with Murat, and not for the first and not for the last time in his career, Murat basically is duped.
Yeah, there's a great quote from Napoleon, if I may. Quote, "I cannot find words to express my displeasure. You only command my vanguard and have no right to agree to an armistice without my orders. You will cost me the fruits of a campaign. End the armistice at once and attack the enemy. Inform him that the general who signed this has no power to make it, that only the Russian emperor has the right. And when the Russian emperor ratifies this agreement, I will also ratify it. But it is only a ruse. March and destroy the Russian army." I love that. I just love that he's yelling at Murat through this communique.
Yes. And having received this letter, that does go on the attack. So Bagration does not have the full 24 hours. But nevertheless, he's able to dig in. And as you say, I think Murat and Lannes together, they have maybe 35,000 men, although not all of them are committed.
Right.
But Bagration only has 7,000, and yet he's able to hold them on for 6-7 hours in battle.
Right. And there's a lot of bravery there. They lose almost 3,000 troops. His core, but there's a lot of bravery on his part, and his men's part in getting them, out of that situation.
Absolutely, and Kutuzov basically gave them up for lost, but Bagration does manage to extricate what's left of his detachment, of his regard, and rejoins Kutuzov.
So he gets back, but unfortunately, he gets back in time for Austerlitz, where he actually performs well, but no one else does on that day.
Yes, pretty much. So Bagration's his forces are deployed on the right flank of the Allied army, and they're actually directly opposite Lannes' Fifth Corps. And so well, I presume everyone who listens to the podcast knows the general story of Austerlitz, where the coalition left essentially storms down the Pratzen Heights to attack a deliberately weakened French right flank, and in the process the center is weakened, and Marshal Soult marches up the Pratzen Heights, and after some bitter fighting manages to take hold of the heights and to basically split the coalition army in two, and that's really Napoleon's strategic masterstroke. But at the time, Lannes and Bagration are sort of sparring against each other, and neither is really capable of achieving an advantage. But Bagration has an idea of what's going on in the rest of the field, so he decides that the only sensible thing to do is to withdraw.
And Marshal Lannes is so upset that basically he's a sideshow. Even in the the bulletin, he gets so upset he leaves the army because he thought he was fighting a pretty stout opponent in Bagration.
That's right. It is quite funny what happens because obviously the a lot of the glory of Austerlitz is handed to the likes of Davout, who's fighting this desperate action on the right bank, and to Soult, who spearheads this attack up the front of the Pratzen. As you said, Lannes felt like he didn't get the credit that he deserved for managing to at least fight Bagration, not only to a stalemate, but actually to force him to retreat.
Yeah, for sure. And the Prince actually gets promoted again in 1805 to lieutenant general. And there's a great quote I want to bring up. Not only was he just a good leader on the field, he really took care of his men and was very worried about their health at all times. The quote is, it's from another Russian who visited Bagration's group, and he wrote, quote, "I visited several times the avant-garde, the advance guard, where many of my friends were serving in Prince Bagration's headquarters. The hospitable manner of the prince with subordinates, amicable relations between themselves, harmony, cleanliness in the tents, the fresh and pleased appearance of the lower grades proved the prince's good treatment and attitude toward them, and in all hearts the pledge of general trust in him," end quote. So it seems like he was a real soldier's general.
Yeah, and it's great you brought that up because he was one of the most popular generals within the Russian army at this point. But also his reputation spread across society, and it was such that in 1806 the court poet Gavrila Dejarvin, in a poem, gave him the nickname Bagration, a play on his name, which literally means God of the Army.
I love that.
Which really reflected, his reputation.
Yeah. Now, at the same time, he didn't always agree with his, other generals like Bennigsen or Kutuzov. Like he or de Tollet, for that matter, he didn't always agree with their strategies.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, and I think over time, as he sort of became more senior, he he wanted to emulate Suvorov, and he wanted to like have, more of a strategic role. But he never really had the opportunity to do that. I mean, in 1807, he participates in the campaign.
Yeah,
that's right, under Bennigsen, and again, he exhibits tremendous bravery in the line of fire at both Eylau and Friedland, but those efforts were obviously in vain, and you have the Treaty of Tilsit in July, which briefly leads to peace between France and Russia, and as a result of that, as a result of the agreement and Napoleon's intentions of basically bringing the whole European continent into his continental system, blockading British commerce, he asked the Russians to basically invade Sweden and force them into joining the continental system.
Right, and so Bagration is reassigned to the Finnish War in 1808.
That's right. One of the most daring operations of the war was when the Russians basically have three columns, and they it's in the winter, so the Gulf of Bothnia is frozen, and these three Russian columns, of which Bagration is the largest in the south, with around 17,000 men or something. They march across the frozen ice to capture the Åland Islands, and this really sort of propels him up the ranks. He becomes a general of infantry not too long after, and in fact the operation was so successful that Bagration sends, having captured the Åland Islands, he sends a cavalry force of like 400 men under General Kornev to press on and to try and essentially get whatever advantage he could, from having surprised the Swedes. But the Swedes were so surprised that he went all the way towards the Swedish mainland and was threatening Stockholm.
I don't think people realize how brave this is to lead 17,000 men plus horses plus heavy cannons plus wagons across ice, which could break at any time and kill your whole force. I just think it's amazing that he did that.
Yeah, but sometimes you've got to you've got to be bold, and you've got to take risks. And obviously the Swedes were completely astonished. Obviously, after such a daring campaign, Bagration, his reputation, only continues to grow. But very soon after this, he is transferred to the Moldavian front to fight the Ottomans. And again, this is to do with rumors that he's engaged in an affair with Grand Duchess Catherine Pavlovna. And this is at an especially interesting juncture, because 1809 is when Napoleon is preparing to divorce Josephine, and to try to and initially he tries to find a Russian bride, and Catherine is the princess that he's got his eyes on, and in various sort of diplomatic communications with the Russians, the Russians kind of get the hint, and she is very quickly married off to Prince George of Oldenburg, or Duke George of Oldenburg, to basically take her off the market. Bagration goes to fight the Ottomans, and while he he performs okay. Really, the main story of his experience fighting the Turks in 1809, 1810 is his rivalry with General Miloradovich. They couldn't stand each other. They were both, trying to be the prima donna, and you can only have one prima donna.
Right, and we can move on with that. With that same line that happened in 1812, the French invasion.
That's right.
De Tolly was the commander in chief, but Bagration was not subordinate because he was the older general. So he was getting orders from the Tsar, but he's also getting orders from De Tolly. And it must have been very confusing for him on what to do or who to listen to.
That's right. So in preparation for the 1812 campaign, the Russians come up with this strategic plan. Basically, they expect Napoleon to march into Russia with an army of, maybe around 200,000 men. And then you'd have Barclay de Tolly as commander-in-chief of the First Western Army, which would, some 130,000 men, which would basically lure Napoleon's forces to a fortified camp on the banks of the river Dvina at Drissa. And there, the Russians, already in their sort of pre-prepared position, would defend against Napoleon's attempt to take the fort. And then you have the Second Western Army under Bagration, some 40, 50,000 men, which would operate in Napoleon's flank and rear, and basically serve as the hammer to Barclay's anvil. Right. And together they would crush Napoleon in the middle.
Yeah, and that's not the way it went, though.
No. But also, just to go back to your point about the command structure. So Barclay de Tolly had been Minister of War, was still Minister of War at that time, and he was instrumental in the preparations for the resumption of hostilities with Napoleon. And so it was taken for granted that the Tsar was, de jure commander-in-chief. So long as the Tsar was around, he would have, official authority over the army.
Of course.
There was the question of, if the Tsar isn't around, or even if the Tsar is there, obviously he'll need, some sort of military officer to serve as de facto commander. And that's what Barclay had proposed. But Alexander decided not to appoint a supreme commander, firstly because he was initially, around at Barclay's headquarters, so he was exercising the duties of a supreme commander as well. But also as to prevent the jealousies of, Bagration or Barclay. So it's like Bagration had full authority over his army of, 50,000. Barclay had full authority over his army of 130,000, but neither had authority over the other's men.
Yeah.
It was only due to the fact that Barclay was also Minister of War, and therefore he could claim to be speaking on or to be giving orders on behalf of the Tsar, that Bagration kind of begrudgingly accepted that, okay, maybe I actually have to listen to this guy.
Yeah, but I think it was interesting, jumping ahead to the Battle of Smolensk in August. He kind of forced de Tolly's hand because he wasn't supposed to go to Smolensk, but he did anyways, just to kind of fortify that town. I think he knew that's where Napoleon was going. So I think it was kind of interesting that he didn't go west as he was ordered. He's like, you know what, I'm going to go to Smolensk with my army. If they totally wants to show up and help me out, great. If not, I'm going to make a stand because I'm tired of retreating.
Yes, well, it's quite interesting how the dynamics how it plays out between the two men. Barclay continues the retreat to Drissa, but once he gets to Drissa, he realizes, well, this camp makes no sense whatsoever. The fortifications aren't done properly, and they're fighting not behind but in front of a river. So
Right.
it's like none of the position makes sense, and the Tsar realizes there's no point
Right.
trying to face Napoleon here. So Barclay retreats to Vitebsk, and that's where the strategic priority at this point is to unite the two Russian armies as quickly as possible, so that Napoleon doesn't get the opportunity to destroy them in detail.
Right.
The Second Army retreats, and once Barclay hears that Bagration has retreated, he's like, well, there's no point in me staying in Vitebsk. So he continues to retreat as well. But Bagration is just like, why are you retreating? Why aren't you standing and fighting?
Right.
And then Barclay's like, well, yeah, I would have stood and fought if you were able to join me. Right. And then Bagration's like, well, I had the VU in the way. So like they're both blaming each other for failing to stand and fight.
Yeah.
And the insults actually get pretty nasty because Bagration sees Barclay as this foreigner, essentially, this German with a French name.
And who doesn't fight? He just keeps retreating. So I could see why the two men would have loggerheads for sure.
And they basically, call each other names. Like Bagration writes to the likes of General Arakcheyev in St. Petersburg, who's very close to the Tsar, and also to General Yermolov, who, even though he's serving as Barclay's chief of staff, he is not Barclay's biggest fan, and he is basically Tsar Alexander basically put him there to keep an eye on Barclay, and therefore you've got these two people who are very close to the Tsar, who are who have some degree of authority over Barclay, basically being told these things by Bagration. Bagration saying, he's a coward, he should face court-martial, and but eventually Barclay and Bagration do manage to join up together at Smolensk, and there is a brief truce for a couple of days. They go inspecting the men, each other's armies, on horseback, hand in hand, as a show of unity.
Just to summarize, Smolensk, it turns into quite a quagmire. Basically the whole town's on fire due to shelling, and so they retreat out of there. I mean, technically it's a loss because they had to retreat, but they really bloodied the nose of Napoleon in that battle.
That's right. I mean, around 20,000 casualties on either side, and which is not bad going given the fact that the Russians did have a smaller army, and really it was only 2 corps, Radsky's 7 corps, and then later relieved by Doktorov's 6 corps, which mainly did the fighting. And at this point, like Barclay, I think already knew that Smolensk was untenable, and he feared encirclement, and therefore, even though the Russians were still holding on, he decided to abandon the city. And he agreed earlier that Bagration would retreat to cover the communications back to Moscow, while he would take over command of the fight in Smolensk. So Bagration's already, carrying out his orders, on his way on the road to Moscow, when he hears that Barclay has withdrawn from the city, and he's completely infuriated, right?
Yeah, let's talk about that. You know, because they moved backwards towards Moscow, and we had the big Battle of Borodino, where basically they construct they're called fletches or arrowhead shaped, like open backed earthworks, basically mini forts in front of Moscow. But they don't have enough engineers, or they don't have enough time to construct them properly. So Bagration and Kutuzov is there, and it's one of the largest battles of the Napoleonic War, and it's just another bloody mess, correct?
Yeah. So with Borodino, it's like Kutuzov, fought it mainly for political reasons, right? He wanted to make a show outside Moscow. You know, he couldn't let the enemy into Moscow without a fight.
Right.
And that's basically what he had been ordered by the Tsar to do. And the way that he deployed his army was that the bulk of the Russian army, the right and center, or Barclay's First Army, was stationed around the the new Smolensk road, which is like the main road leading from Smolensk to Moscow. And Bagration, his second army, again, like, by this point, 30,000-40,000 men, it's kind of left rather exposed on the left flank. And there are various theories why this was the case. Kutuzov may have kind of wanted to lure the French into attacking Bagration, knowing how well equipped Bagration was as a defensive general to cope with the onslaught. The other explanation is just that Kutuzov was terrified about being essentially being outflanked and on his right, and the French basically marching on Moscow, having sort of overcome any sort of defenses on the New Smolensk road, and therefore Kutuzov wanted to make sure that his right and center was very strong.
This is unfortunately going to be the last stand of our protagonist. Do you want to talk about, because I keep reading about how he died, and it sounds
yeah. So as I said, he was on the left, around the village of Semyonovskaya, the weakest sector of the Russian line. So in order to bolster them, he does order the construction of these flashes in front of the village. But during the course of the battle, like, the flashes were captured and recaptured, as many as 7 or 8 times. Wave after wave of attacks and counterattacks, and this is part of Bagration's doctrine as well. Even when on the defensive, he rather than just waiting in line, he mobilizes reserves to if his position is overrun or something, then he will use his reserves to attack in column at the point of the bayonet to retake any positions. So this is why the flashes are arrow-shaped, because they're open at the back. So they allow, it's kind of easy for reinforcements to retake those positions. And at times, it seemed like this god of the army was a real god, kind of,
I love in his manual, there was the words "we are cut off" are not allowed to be said, and it's brave people are never cut off. Wherever the enemy goes, turn your breast to follow and defeat him. End quote. And I just, that speaks to his mind. Like, I don't care if I'm surrounded or in a flesh or in front of Moscow. I'll defeat wherever the enemy is. I'll defeat him.
Exactly. So, like, Bagration is not, his career, he's been remarkably cool under fire. So he's not phase. He's not afraid. He's been in such situations before, and he rallies his men for wave after wave of counterattack. But at some point in the morning, various sources differ about the time, but it was probably around 9 o'clock. After already the flèches had changed hand a few times. Bagration was giving orders for counterattack, waving his sword, hurrah! And at that point, enemy shell struck his I think it was his left thigh.
Right.
And
he's wounded in the leg, and he's taking from the field, and he's not killed outright. But I guess the sight of him being taken away by the field it impacts the morale of the army, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, this guy is the god of the army. It's he seemed immortal,
right?
And he's so popular among the men that obviously and even if they didn't think that he was killed, they didn't know how bad the wound was going to be, or so on. So obviously the Russian lines buckled, and had the French been able to press their attack at this point, maybe they would have seen quite a bit of success.
Right.
And at this point you had junior Russian generals basically rushing into the counterattack and sacrificing their lives in the process in order to make sure that the Russian line remained intact.
Right.
And
does it develop gangrene, or how does he die exactly?
Essentially, Bagration lingers on for about 20 days, still anxious about the fate of Russia and its army. And doctors advised amputating his wounded leg in order to stop the spread of gangrene, but Bagration refused, supposedly saying, I came into this earth with 2 legs. How can I meet my maker with just one?
Right.
So he basically refuses amputation, and as a result of that, he finally succumbs on the 24th of September, and at that point he's been evacuated to Sima in Vladimir province, and he's staying at the house of one of his friends. And by this point, Napoleon was already in Moscow, and Bagration would have had some idea that this was the case.
Yeah.
And this would obviously have added to his sense of grief and loss.
The tragic part is that he died while Napoleon's in Moscow, so he didn't get to see the other Russian generals see Napoleon defeated. He kind of died before the epic ended. Well, what do you think his legacy is, though, Bagration? He was so talented. His troops loved him. He was very good at organizing. Discipline was important. He reminds me a bit of Davout as well. Just he respected the bravery of his troops, and he always tried to look after them.
Yeah, I mean, again, the Davout comparison is very interesting because of his of the demands he made of his men, but also of I think I think Bagration was a lot kinder to his men than Davout was.
Oh, yeah.
But the loyalty that he managed to inspire, and again his tremendous defensive skills, and he remains his memory remains very much in the memory of the Russian army. So in 1839, his remains were transferred to the battlefield of Borodino, at the foot of the new monument on the Razki redoubt, on the Great Redoubt.
Interesting.
And again, this was actually the idea of Denis Davidov, the famed partisan commander, who, funny enough, like Davidov had grown up on the Borodino estate. So it was basically his patrimony, and he had this idea of repatriating, not repatriating, but transferring Bagration's remains to the site of his last heroic battle.
Right.
And Davidov, the plans were for him to lead the escort, but unfortunately Davidov himself dies very shortly before the ceremony. But even after that, Bagration's heroic death at Borodino, very much like Nelson at Trafalgar, creates this myth among both the Russian army and the Russian people. And for much of the last 2 centuries, his name is only second to Kutuzov in the pantheon of heroes of 1812. Which does take away a bit from from the likes of Barclay. And it's interesting because despite his princely status, he remained a popular hero during the Soviet era. And part of this may have been due to the fact that he was a fellow Georgian to Stalin. And
good point.
During the Second World War, Stalin sort of built on Bagration's memory by calling this major operation to reconquer Belarus, Operation Bagration, in June 1944. And then in 1946, when the Soviets annexed part of East Prussia, which they renamed Kaliningrad, the town of Eylau, where Bagration had fought with distinction, was renamed Bagrationovsk in his honor.
That's interesting.
So it's this legacy, this myth continues, and even in the after the fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1990s, I believe, an equestrian statue was erected to him in Moscow, not too far away from the Kutuzov's equestrian statue and the Battle of Borodino Panorama Museum. And it's kind of shows him with his holding his sword aloft, like giving his orders, about to charge. So it's a very sort of dynamic statue, which really, I think, sort of embodies the essence of the man. Like, he was always active on the battlefield, always giving orders.
Always leading from the front. Exactly. Well, I learned a lot, Jimmy. That was some biography. I knew a little bit of him, but I really appreciate the details. I just a phenomenal respect for the man. So thank you so much for that.
Very happy, and I think I hope also that our audience will have learned a lot about this remarkable character. And as you quoted from Napoleon, I think it's a bit unfair to say that he was Russia's only good general, but he was certainly one of the best.
Indeed. And for my listeners, again, the website that Jimmy lives and breathes is called NapoleonicImpressions.com, and I suggest everyone at least go check it out.